Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nayana Jayarajan, and I work with KAICIID. And today we're discussing how religious communities and religious leaders can contribute to protect the vulnerable during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we meet today, let's just pause to recognize that as of Sunday night, the coronavirus pandemic has killed over 500,000 people in just over 6 months. And at the same time, the economic and social toll of this pandemic threatens to create so many other types of vulnerability. Religious leaders and religious communities have, of course, been active since the very beginning of this pandemic, providing pastoral and charitable support to millions of vulnerable people. Ways of worship and gathering have also been deeply affected, and religious minorities have become increasingly vulnerable in some places, both from the virus, but also from negative perceptions and stereotyping. For us at KAICIID, our work revolves around mobilizing and supporting the work of religious communities to work together to address shared challenges just like this one. And so we are especially pleased to have with us today 4 members of our Multireligious Board of Directors. Each of them is, of course, working in this area in their own right, but together they also guide our work here at KAICIID. Before I hand over to our first speaker, just a quick house rules, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with in this age of Zoom, but I'll go over them really quickly just in case. To allow our speakers as much time as possible, we'll be sharing their bios in the chat, so please keep an eye out for that. At the same time, I'd also like to invite all of our listeners to please share their names and their affiliations and the communities that they represent in the group chat as well. We'd love to hear from you. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A. We'll gather questions in the Q&A box, which is situated at the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop. If you would like to ask a question, and I very much hope that many of you will, please type it in there and send it to us. If you'd like to direct it to a particular speaker, please indicate that as well so we can take that forward. This webinar is being recorded, so if you need to step out early, or if you'd like to revisit a particular section or possibly share it with your network, you can always come back and watch it on our website and on our social media channels. That's KAICIID.org. Just a point of note, one of our speakers will be speaking in Azeri. Interpretation into English is available, and I'll be stepping back in to let you know how to access that just before he speaks. So please keep listening for that. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Mohammed Abu Nimer, to start us off.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom for everyone, and salam as well. Thank you all for joining us into this webinar. My really role is just to say a few words about framing and just trying to clarify a little bit of what KAICIID has done in this area of helping or working with the vulnerable communities. I mean, first of all, for us, vulnerable communities, we're relating to 3 categories at least. One, people who are in risky groups health-wise, and they were identified due to age or existing health issues. And category, as Nayana, my colleague, described, the victims of stigmatization or stereotyping, or because of their ethnic or religious affiliation, they've been classified or stereotyped as a threat to the community. These are all vulnerable communities. A special attention, we've been saying, need to be given to them, and this webinar really coming to shed the light and put a little more focus on it. KAICIID first statement actually on the COVID-19 related to this, and following that, we've had this year at least increase in 50% in the number of small grants we gave to many of our partners and our fellows in order to implement the projects. Many of them deal with number of these vulnerability group. In a survey we did with the fellows about a month and a half ago, we've got tens of examples from different parts of the world in how they focus on serving the vulnerable communities through education, sensitization, or even supporting those who provide actual services. We do not provide actual services, but we convene people who do this. But at least 18 different initiatives in 12 different countries, to some extent, have focused on COVID and also dealt with the vulnerable communities. I hope, and we look forward for the input from all our esteemed and honorable board members who will hopefully give us their experience and share with us what they have seen and observed in dealing with vulnerable community in their own community as well as outside. Back to you, Nayana, so we can continue.
Then I thank you, Mohammed. I'd like to invite our first speaker from the board, Chief Rabbi David Rosen.
Thank you, Nayana. And to those important opening words of Professor Abu Nimr, I would perhaps add that one of the great saving graces in the face of the COVID-19 epidemic has been the power of technology that we are using now, and that we've been able to find ways of communicating even when there's been social distancing. And therefore, we've been able to offer comfort, succor, counseling, some form, therefore, of emotional support for people who are vulnerable each in their different way. But then there are those that are vulnerable precisely in terms of such technology, because not everybody has access to technology. So one of the most significant vulnerable communities are those who are isolated in every way, even more than before, because they don't have the access to the tools that we are able to employ, the modern tools we're able to employ. I might also mention, in addition to the elderly, sick, the poor, and the minorities, there are also groups, especially here, that we, within Israel, that we have had to address the needs of asylum seekers, migrant communities, foreign workers, people who don't necessarily have the support structure that we need to be able to address. So this has really been important. And of course, there have been questions that have related to the political context here, and especially within the Palestinian territories and those within refugee camps. Not only a question of access, but the problems and the challenge of densely populated areas where infection rate by definition is going to increase. Here we've seen some very wonderful work on the part of social services, including religious organizations. One particular organization is one called Rabbis for Human Rights that's been addressing these issues specifically with regards to Palestinian society. The economic consequences obviously have been devastating across the world. I suppose one of the particular things one sees in Jerusalem, and that affects both, again, Israelis and Palestinians, is the impact upon tourism, which is obviously, tourism is a field of endeavor which has been terribly affected, inevitably and obviously, by the shutdown and by the closure of skies and access, and things come to a standstill. It's all well and good for those of us who are able to enjoy perhaps greater freedom and less congestion as a result of the absence of tourism, but for those whose lives depend upon it, this is of course very serious. And religious tourism in particular, especially in relation to Jerusalem, and therefore this affects religious communities and the whole fabric of different communities. Speaking from a particular Jewish perspective is not simple, because even though we are a tiny people, a tiny religious community in the world, we are broken down into very many different components, straddling both an enormous social strata as well as denominations and different divisions within it. One particular community that has been disproportionately affected in so many ways by COVID-19 and that has required special attention is the ultra-Orthodox community, often referred to by the word Haredi. But the ultra-Orthodox community is very much a closed community, some of it more closed than other, but essentially it is a segment of the Jewish community that wants to preserve what they see as a traditional way of life that is not affected, if you'll excuse the pun, by modern culture and modern society, and therefore seeks to live already in isolation. But this isolation, in a sense, is its comeuppance, because it's such a socially integrated community on its own that things, and it's they have large families, and there are various not only community celebrations, but also Jewish religious life is very communally orientated. So prayer, even though it's possible to pray as we pray 3 times a day by yourself, nevertheless, it's considered meritorious and desirable to pray together with a quorum. That means you come together as part of a community, aside from the fact that obviously within those communities there are more weddings because the populations are higher. In addition to that, Orthodox Judaism highly values education. This already goes back more than 2,000 years. But within the Orthodox community, devoting your life as much as possible, your daily life as well, to study, religious study, the study of Talmud, commentaries and tradition, is considered one of the most important religious aspects of one's life. And therefore you have the institutions which are often called seminaries. The Hebrew word yeshiva really means a place where you sit and study, which are not purely for qualifications. They are because from a Jewish point of view, to know God's word, his will, his way, that would be within Islam, Sharia, within Judaism, it's halakha, and it comes out of the Talmud and of scripture, etc., is a religious duty in itself. And you study this in a particular fashion. Study halls that may have 1,000 people in them are nevertheless made up of pairs. You study in a system that's known as chavruta, partnership. And therefore the whole engagement of study and religious devotion, dedication is a social activity. Now that inevitably comes to a standstill under these conditions. And there was a lot of opposition to it within those communities because in a sense, you're taking away their fundamental raison d'etre. So it was an enormous effort to have to persuade rabbis and teachers within those communities to accept the idea of social distancing, which in the end they did. But nevertheless, those communities have disproportionately been affected, whether in Israel or in the United States or in London, in England and other places of the world where those communities are to be found. And this is a problem because inevitably, even within a Jewish community, but certainly outside, those communities are seen as disproportionately infected and therefore potentially disproportionately infecting. And this adds, of course, to stereotypes and to negative attitudes that the Jewish community has always suffered from, and in a sense has a historic trauma that gets exacerbated as a result of these particular situations. Let me just add to those comments that it's very difficult, again, as I said, to talk in generalizations with regards to the Jewish community, but I'm very encouraged and gratified to see the way Jewish social service organizations have contributed to the needs of vulnerable communities totally beyond the needs of our own Jewish community. And I would just like to mention a few of those, specifically American or international organizations. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which operates in 16 countries and seeks to provide access to healthcare and fresh water throughout those countries, countering bigotry and hate, and specifically taking a stand on behalf of asylum seekers, particularly in American context. There's been work together with the Catholic Diocese of El Paso to advocate for these particular rights. The Joint Distribution Community, which is a global Jewish organization, is particularly working in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Africa, and even India. We're amongst the poor and elderly, providing food and medication. And the American Jewish World Service has been providing information and safety kits from Haiti to Senegal to India. So I would say in terms of Jewish religious social services, there has been a very positive response, both internally and globally. But of course, we must never be satisfied with any response because it is never enough in the face of the urgent humanitarian crisis that we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Rosen. I'll hand over to our next speaker now, Dr. Vinu Aram.
To keep time, and may I use some slides to assist and support my presentation. And as the slides come, I think I want to add to what my colleague Rabbi Rosen has spoken about the great gift of technology in these times, and how technology has allowed us to be connected, but also how technology has shown the divides again. But may I also say something that we have experienced in the course of the pandemic has been a sense of community. And I think I would like to touch upon this as I share my experience working in India with Shanti Ashram and the government, but also looking now almost 4 or 5 months into the pandemic as to what this means for the most vulnerable amongst us. Nayana, you did speak about the numbers as of last Sunday. I want to reiterate 10 million people around the world have tested positive. In my own country, about 566,000 people have tested positive. So just to keep the numbers in perspective, never before has a public health crisis brought the world to a halt. And in that global map, I think all of us are looking for our own communities and seeing the impact, but we have also been brought together as a global community to see what the consequence of this has been worldwide. Next slide. I want to reiterate what these numbers mean to us. There is a story behind it. As the pandemic spread, first we spoke about demographics, that the elderly were the most vulnerable. As the pandemic came to India, we knew that the young and the old made up about half the numbers of people affected by COVID-19, and the middle half were actually people in the most productive years of life. And here, Professor Abuniba's mentioned about the at-risk approach made sense. People in their working years, going out to work in urban cities, urbanization, and everything that accompanied it made them more at risk. Gender. Initially, we kept discussing worldwide that men were more affected than women. And why was this the case? We discussed this. As the pandemic persists, in my own community, I see the impact of it on women has been particularly severe. Women who have a double burden in low-income families to manage their household, to go out and work, and also be part of the informal workforce. So again, the changing story of gender. We do know poverty and income inequities have played out during the course of the pandemic. We see this across the world, that amongst the people who have tested positive and who have lost their life, more and more of them are people who already had the burden of poverty and income inequities that was there within our society. We've also seen in societies and communities where the sense of community was not as much, social cohesion was not as much. As the pandemic progresses, we find the mental health crisis deepening and worsening. So in some ways, what we find, the story behind the numbers and that which contributes to the vulnerability of both our communities, but also of vulnerable people, are the legacies of structural violence and also the impact of the virus. So there is a coming together of old factors and new factors that make people vulnerable. And I want us to be reminded, because the way we respond to this pandemic and the consequence going forward, and in the last months, has been because of the understanding and the growing understanding of this story. I must remind ourselves that in January, the coronavirus was just mentioned. In the last 4 months, we know not only much more about the virus itself, thanks to scientists around the world who have deconstructed the RNA sequence, told us how it comes and attaches itself to cells, but also in the way that it has found intersections with the existing problems that we have as a global community, but also about particular sections of the community that are vulnerable to it. So the story is important to remember, even as we prepare ourselves for the next few months and come to terms with the impact of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the constant question is, who is most vulnerable? We did hear in the beginning that people who have comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension, lung diseases, they tend to be most vulnerable. But I think what I want to also highlight is people who already are challenged with access issues to healthcare facilities, testing, isolation, access to care. All of them have become much more vulnerable. No one country in the world has been able to solve the enormous burden that it has placed on our healthcare systems. We've had to expand very quickly our healthcare support systems to meet with the pandemic. I mean, you saw that in the UK, you saw it in Italy, you saw that in America. I see it in my country, in India. I think it also brings to highlight that the vulnerability that the virus has shown, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, is not only on human lives, but it has also demonstrated the systemic gaps that allows for this vulnerability to continue and to be perpetuated. So I think the most vulnerable will be linked to the story behind the numbers, which is the old and the young. We know 1.5 billion children for the first time in global history are out of classrooms. They are confined to their homes. They can't play with their friends. And in a recent study that we did with adolescent children in Shanti Ashram, we found that the two most dominant emotions they pointed to that they were experiencing was anger and sadness together. And this is also a part of the pandemic. While children have not been the first victims, the consequence of it has made them most vulnerable. So just to take that time to understand who is the most vulnerable. Next slide, please. I want to also reiterate in this slide the intersections between poverty, between powerlessness, the disease itself, and vulnerability. And one of the things that I want to highlight, because in these last 10 to 12 weeks, I have been so encouraged to see how local communities have responded and how both their faith as well as the services of faith communities have come into play. Many of us have had this pause to look at how we have functioned as communities. And the idea of service, seva in the Hindu tradition, came out so well in the first months. Not just institutions, individuals stepped up to help one another. Neighborhoods came together. And now as the pandemic goes on into its 6th month and the 7th month, faith communities have mobilized resources in an unprecedented way because they provide the last mile connectivity. But as Rabbi Rosen said, they also provide hope in these very uncertain terms. And so for me, the services of the faith communities have come in such a beautiful way together at the service of the community. Locally, I think the most relevant piece of the work of faith-based institutions have been its local presence and how they're able to provide both a sense of community, but also concrete help because they know these intersections as well as the governments know, and they've been able to do that. I also must reiterate here that faith, not in terms of just a religious practice, but faith as a way of also accompanying action and thinking in these difficult times has been very important. I remember just day before yesterday, a mother living with HIV, Shanti Ashram has a 11-year-old running program for families and children living with HIV. She said in the last 100 days, she has not got work. She has got work and she had income only for 4 days. And she said the stigma that accompanied the early days of HIV seems to have come back. And I looked at myself and I said, so much of the good work that was done 2 decades ago might be reversed if we don't find the faith, if we don't find the courage to challenge ourselves against some of these practices as well. And I think in the local neighborhoods, faith communities, as well as in national initiatives, faith communities have come together. I must say in India itself, there was a moment when certain faith communities, religious communities were targeted. And very quickly, we came together in an interfaith framework saying, let the problem not divide us. This is a shared problem. And city after city, we came out with interfaith declarations so that no one community could be marginalized. I want us to remember that. And I want to focus on 3 things. Next slide, please, because there is so much that one can share in terms of the experience of vulnerability and what vulnerable communities are facing. But I want to focus on 3 things. One is what children are facing. I already mentioned about 1.5 billion children being out of school, about how they're at the receiving end at home, whether it is domestic violence, whether it is hunger and food insecurity, whether it is lack of access to quality educational materials. They are at the receiving end, and I will come back to children in a bit. But I want to focus on the second problem now, which is hunger and food security. In many countries of the world, including India, hunger seemed to be an experience of the past. But a recent study showed that the utilization of the government-supported public distribution system that ensures the distribution of grains has been at an all-time high. Next slide, and I just want to reiterate what I'm saying is this is in terms of children. That's the scale of the problem. This slide is one of my favorite slides. If you just pay attention to it, on one state, the most populous state of India, Uttar Pradesh, the pediatric population or the number of children in the state is equivalent to all the children in the United States of America. The second state, Bihar, the children equal Ethiopia. Why do I say this? Because I think collaboration has also been forged between different sections of society, including faith communities, because the scale of the problem has been so high. But if you come to the next slide, I would like to focus a little bit on the burden, that is hunger and food security. And here again, I think I want to say that while the problem is massive, it is across the country, we've had to make sense locally. We've had to prioritize who will need our help most, and we've had to ensure that connectivity is there between what the government is saying, what the government is trying to distribute, and how it reaches the most vulnerable amongst us. This poster, it will be shared later, is the role of women in this pandemic. Shanti Ashram has 90 rural women entrepreneurs, and they've been working overtime because they have seen hunger and the risk of food insecurity so imminent in their communities. So I think when we speak of vulnerable communities, some of these issues have become very real. Care for children, ensuring food security, and of course the third piece, if you move to the next slide, I will speak about this problem as well, which is public health outreach. One thing that hasn't changed between January and June is the ways that we will respond to the pandemic. Physical distancing, wearing of the mask, using of the sanitizers. It seems so simple, but it's so difficult. We all know how difficult it is to ensure behavior modification. And so the faith communities have played a major role in reinforcing this message every week to their communities. And here is one effort where it's an interfaith approach. Young people from different communities came together to speak to their families and to their community. I speak of concrete action because I think during the pandemic, one of the ways to support vulnerable communities has to accompany every effort of thinking together with concrete efforts of serving our community. And here is a brilliant effort of our young people from different religious communities in my city to speak in their neighborhoods about the importance of the public health outreach. May I come to the final part of my presentation now, if you move to the next slide. I want to focus also about the importance of interfaith collaboration. Like Rabbi Rosen said, like it was mentioned in the beginning, it's so easy for us to be divided during these times, because when you're afraid, when you're cornered, when you feel alone, it's easy to be divided. But I think what we have learned from the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the past, which is about 2 decades ago, where for the first time interfaith collaboration yielded concrete efforts, we have learned that we should be together. And so in my city and city after city, we have encouraged faith communities not only to talk within their communities, but to work together and show acts of solidarity. So I cannot reiterate that more. If we move to the next slide, there's something else that I want to mention, which is about the way faith-based organizations or faith inspiration has worked during the time of the pandemic. I recall the words of Mahatma Gandhi, where he says, faith does not admit of telling alone. And therefore, I'm so encouraged not only by the work that I see in my local community firsthand, be a part of that solution, provisioning of services that are extended, but also part of the national effort, but also to see what KAICIID is doing at the moment. Over 12 countries, there are initiatives led by our own young peace fellows. There are initiatives led through the support that we have given in the way of the micro grants to initiate work, concrete work in the communities. So with that point, I think I'd like to just conclude by saying the pandemic is not going to leave us for a few months, it seems, at least in my country. We're already talking about the next 2 quarters and preparation to live with the virus. But I think what we need to prepare intensely is how we care for the most vulnerable amongst us. This is a challenge to our faith. This is a challenge to the way we function as a society. And this is a challenge that we have to face together. And I'm therefore particularly delighted that KAICIID has brought us together this evening to think about vulnerability and vulnerable communities. Over to you, Naina.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aram. Before I hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Samak, who I thank very much for joining us in spite of considerable connectivity issues, I'd just like to ask all of our attendees, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. We'll find them anyway, but please let us know if you have questions. With that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Samak, if he can hear us. My apologies, I think the connectivity issues have not left us entirely. Perhaps then I would ask our next speaker to step in, Reverend Sudworth, while we see if we can get Dr. Smart back online.
Hello there, thank you for your welcome and for listening in. Just to sort of give a sense of where I'm going to go and speak from in this short address. So as a priest in the Church of England, I'll speak first and foremost to the UK context, and then more broadly share a couple of anecdotes and illustrations from the Anglican Communion, so something of the worldwide Anglican Church of which we are a part, which reflects some of the sort of colonial history of the UK in its locations. I think I'd like to sort of go back just a little bit in terms of the beginnings of the pandemic and reflect first of all on some of the issues, questions and challenges and the responses that have been, certainly in the UK, across faith traditions around our ethics. So we've heard talk already from each of the speakers around categories of vulnerability. And certainly at the beginnings of this pandemic, many of us and many of our governments were faced with the question, really what I would regard as a false binary. Do we sacrifice the elderly and the physically vulnerable, or do we sacrifice the economy? And certainly at an early stage, a number of our own church leaders and other faith leaders were very keen to advocate and present to government the inherent value of every single person. And actually there's a religious voice that I think will need to be maintained in this discourse as we've begun to see second and further waves of contagion, that actually we don't put a price on the head of the vulnerable, and that there is a voice of faith that wants to avoid putting people in categories where they're disposable. And there's been some really good cross-working and voicing those concerns to government in the UK. A second point, and it's been said already, but I do want to really affirm this. In many ways, what we are seeing is not, well, alongside the actual impact of the virus in terms of casualties and the losses and the real and profound grief of many, many families and communities, what we're actually seeing through this pandemic is the revealing and deepening of pre-existing fissures, pre-existing challenges. The people that are most at risk are, by and large, the ones that have already been most vulnerable, most disadvantaged in our society. We see that keenly here in the UK. in the statistics, which really reveal that the Black and minority ethnic communities are suffering the highest casualty rates, and it's too early to really unpack the detail around that. But it's part of a complex of those that are in the occupation that are most vulnerable. We depend on cleaners, on auxiliary workers in our hospitals, often the most poorly paid, those that are often living in most congested and multi-generational living conditions, and in our cities, traveling on the tube where there is lots of potential cross-infection. So just to highlight, actually, in the Christian tradition, we have this word, the apocalypse, and people have talked of the pandemic being apocalyptic in some way. The literal meaning of apocalypse is a revealing. And I think for people of faith, what is it in these current crises that reveals to us actually the state of our nation, the state of our priorities, what is important to us, and what might God be saying in the midst of this revealing? And so I think people of faith and our deep religious traditions have something to say about that. What does it reveal about pre-existing injustices? And it's no coincidence that the Black Lives Matter controversy from the States, the murder of George Floyd, has rebounded in particularly powerful ways across the world, and particularly into the UK, because of those pre-existing issues which just become sharper as we're impacted in the current time. Just to highlight one anecdote, and the questions posed within this webinar are huge, so I'll just kind of pick on a few anecdotes that help illustrate. Here in the UK, there's been a huge constructive response, which again reveals pre-existing relationships, pre-existing service to the community in terms of food banks. So already we've heard of food poverty, and it may be surprising to listeners, viewers from around the world, but the UK has had an exponential rise in the provision of charitable giving of food to those who do not have food. And even those with jobs, with incomes, have often suffered from food poverty. And that has escalated inevitably during the pandemic, during lockdown. And some of those projects have been across faith traditions. I think of a church in West London, where they have been packing 400 meals a day from their church building to distribute to families, particularly with children that aren't having enough food each day. That is done in partnership and from the provision of food from the local Hindu temple. So there is a partnership to work together across faith traditions to really provide resources to those most in need at this current time. So we're getting glimmers of what's possible, affirmations of community and work for the common good, and among some of the bad news. Just to kind of broaden the sights really to some of the stories that we're hearing across the Anglican Communion, and to reaffirm that where there is disadvantage, what the pandemic is doing is just multiplying that pre-existing disadvantage. So for some of the Christian communities in a minority situation, religiously and socio-economically, they're finding that lockdown is devastating. We are hearing huge stories of great poverty, great need, requests for assistance in community development, because some of our Christian communities around the world, when there is a lockdown, it means they can't get to work, and therefore they have no food, no money to feed their families day by day. And this is devastating. And another part of this we are seeing in countries where the democratic kind of institutions are thin, that actually the pandemic has been exploited by the leadership to really inhibit human rights and voices for democratic exchange in parliament and the press and freedom of speech. And we're how faith leaders can work globally to shore up human rights at this time, rather than to allow those with pernicious aims to exploit this for their own ends. That's a real challenge. And just to add into that, you know, that there has been a voice from Religions for Peace, and there'll be further voices of note expressed this week to advocate to the Security Council for a ceasefire in the midst of this pandemic. These kind of ventures, the kind of geopolitical arena for interreligious action seem absolutely vital at this time. And I think just as a final note, and it's maybe a sobering kind of warning, that both here in the UK is a developed country with considerable wealth and advantage, but right across the Anglican Communion with very different experiences of power, privilege, and income, this pandemic will be devastating financially. And the structures, both for social capital, for public service, will be pared down to the bone right across the world. And in that context, work for the common good across traditions actually will become more and more important, because the need will be greater. I'm talking to church leaders, mosque leaders, temple leaders who are saying, we may have to close down because we have no money, no funds. But the need to serve publicly is huge. And we are being reminded, actually, and we've seen glimmers in this in the good news stories, how interdependent we are. And I'll finish with a quotation from the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. I heard him speak on the subject of the climate change challenge. And we need to mention this when we've seen glimmers of quieter streets and you know, less pollution in some of our big cities, and bird song that we're suddenly hearing for the first time. And we can't forget this challenge, which is a cross-faith challenge. But Rowan Williams said, there are some challenges which affect every single one of us, whoever we are, whatever we believe. This pandemic has been one of those. Climate change continues to be that sort of challenge. If we can't work across our traditions to face a challenge that affects every single one of us, then we are diminished, because the power to exert and bring transformation and change is diminished. And as people of faith, surely this is the time for us to be working together more and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sudworth. Our next speaker is Dr. Samark. So I will hand over to him now. Welcome, Dr. Samark. I'm glad you were able to join us. Dr. Samark, I have to, perfect, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me now. And my approach to this very delicate subject is from Islamic point of view. And I will try to answer the big question mark, what Islam says about those vulnerable people or victims or whoever in such a pandemic situation. I'll speak about the principles in a summarized notes. In 5 points, actually, I have in mind. Point number 1 is that according to Islamic teachings, God created all human beings from one soul. That's in the Quran. When we say from one soul, we mean all human beings are one family. And being one family means that we are responsible for the other. In times of pandemic, our responsibility is to the other. In India, in Brazil, in the United States, in the Middle East, in Africa, wherever is the same, because it is all people, all humans are brothers and sisters and one family. It's a family. During pandemic, the whole human beings should behave as a family. Now, the second point is that according to Islamic teachings also, all human beings are dignified. The dignity of a human being is to respect and help and assist during pandemics and during problems or times, difficult times or crises. To defend the dignity of a human being is to be with him with all means, with all possibilities. So, and when we say all human beings are dignified, it has nothing to do with religion, with ethnicity, with different of religion, with different of ethnicity, or color, or culture, or whatsoever. All human beings are dignified, not because they are believers in God, but because they are simply because they are human beings. And this is the second point. The third point is about human mercy. In Islam, one of the names of God is the merciful. And it is in the teaching of Islam that to get the mercy of God, you have to give mercy to the other. It is the way to reach the mercy of God through being mercy to the other. And here again, the other is not necessarily a Muslim. For Muslims, is not necessarily a believer, just as a human being. And in time of pandemic, to be merciful is to feel with the other, to help the other, and to assist him in a time of crisis. Now, the third point, the second point, the third point I would like to find is the protection of the other. You know, there is a very well-known verse in the Bible as well as in the Quran and the Old Testament that says that killing a human being, innocent human being, is like killing all humanity. And the second part of this verse in the Quran, it says, protecting a human being is like protecting all humanity. Now, the protection of vulnerable people during pandemic, any single human being is like protecting all humanity. And we know that during pandemic, a disease will not stop with this human being, it will spread. And that's why protecting a single human being is protecting all humanity, especially during pandemics. Now, let me be clear, and here I would like to raise a very essential issue. When we speak about the other in all these cases, and we say that we are a family, I don't speak about Muslim family or the family of the Abrahamic traditions, Jewish, Christians, and Muslims. I mean human family. And this is not a matter of point of view. I'm here speaking on behalf of Islam. And it is in Islam that says that God, the mercy of God, is that his message to be received and to be known by all peoples all over the world. And nobody, no people are excluded from the message of God. The second point is that God had sent his messengers to all peoples. And the third point is that not all prophets and messengers are mentioned in the Quran. This means that there are many messengers who are not mentioned in the Quran, who are messengers from God with their messages. That's why we are speaking here about peoples of different religions and of different beliefs within the Abrahamic tradition and outside the Abrahamic tradition. And these all people are included within the family of humanity that we have to take care and to feel that there should be no vulnerable or victims because he has a different religion or he has different interpretation or has different ethnicity. So these points from Islamic perspective, I believe they put us in a position by which we feel our responsibility towards all human beings, no vulnerability here. Saving one human being is like saving all humanity, and this is our job and our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samak. Closing out this panel today is a board member from Azerbaijan, His Virtue Allah Shukur Pashazadeh, who will be speaking to us today in Azeri. There is interpretation available. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a tab that says interpretation. And when you click on that, please select the channel for English. I must apologize if you see Spanish on there, but Zoom apparently does not allow for Azeri to be recognized as a language, which is something to keep in mind for the future. But please switch to your English channel to hear the interpretation of our next panelist's speech. And with that, I'd like to hand over to His Virtue Pashazadeh.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear, it's a great honor for me to join you, to be able to speak to you. I've been listening very attentively, and indeed, yes, we really need to have such meetings, come together and discuss these challenges. Dr. Aram mentioned a very important point, and my friend Rabbi Rosen, Mr. Richard, and my Dr. Samak, points that you mentioned that are very important. And we indeed really feel that when you get sick, when you get ill, when you feel this pain, and when you have this pain, even if the person has a different religion, but when you have something common, you feel this proximity. In these challenging times, people come together, people support each other, they help each other. We've witnessed the Second World War in the fight against fascism, and today I could say, I would call it a war actually against pandemic. We all have to come together, not just faith leaders, but politicians, public figures, and faith leaders. We have to but when it comes to the faith leaders, we need to console people. We need to increase the faith in God. And we need to give them hope for the future. And of course, within our capacity, we also have to provide some moral and financial pandemic period. I called on the head of the state. There was a special fund allocated for churches, for synagogues, for mosques, and through them, those who are in need, especially children, the elderly, receive this assistance. It was millions of dollars assistance was provided, and even today this assistance is being rendered today. Christians and Jewish communities and Muslim communities together we're celebrating the Ramadan and Easter and Pesach. We celebrated it together. I had a rabbi and a pastor on my right and left, so we celebrated it together. And the main aim here was to show to the society that we have to be together regardless of our faith. Greatly display this sense of unity. Of course, this is life. Sometimes there are some funerals. We help them to hold these funerals, even though funerals restricted. Jewish and Muslim and Christian communities, with my initiative, we had the blood donorship campaign for those who are suffering with the disease, because those suffering with the disease really in need of blood. I myself, and pastor and rabbis, and other faith leaders. We displayed it even on TV. And we called on our people to join this blood donorship campaign. Therefore, we, the people, have come together. Azerbaijan is providing assistance to its vulnerable people, and it's the head of the state has initiated to provide financial assistance to more than 30 countries. And therefore, these initiatives are still underway. I would really like to see that faith leaders contribute to these initiatives. We have to be together with the people. Our president, Ilham Aliyev, have made a call on the UN Security Council conflict. There will be a ceasefire. There will be no confrontation. Boycotting or creating confrontation between the states or waging wars have to be stopped. And of course, all of this hampering the efforts to fight pandemic. Armenia occupied 20% of Azerbaijani lands, and we are unable to help in those occupied territories. Of course, this can be anywhere else in the world. So therefore, the faith leaders have to be very well prepared. In the former Soviet countries, in the CIS countries, we had a conference. How are they going to work in the future? We had a very good meeting, and soon we'll have a video conference in Caucasus. Patriarch Kirill, be it a Jewish, Catholic, or faith leaders across the CIS, will be joining the video conference to discuss some of the solutions. Of course, everything is in the hands of God. So God will help us, I believe. But we have to be very active. We have to contribute. I would like to thank for giving me the chance to join this meeting. Wishing you happiness and I wish to see the end of disease. Whoever is facing it, I wish that God ends this disease for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Virtue. Something that you mentioned in your intervention. Sorry, before I begin, can I just ask all the panelists to mute their microphones? That would be great. Thank you very much. I'd like to start off the round of questions, and also thank you to the attendees who put in all of their questions into the Q&A box. I'd like to start the first question from something that His Virtue Bashazadeh mentioned, which has also come up in the attendees Q&As, which is the work that religious leaders can do together with policymakers. This is, of course, a central aspect of our work here at KAICIID, so that's something that we're quite interested in. And I would like to begin by asking you, Reverend Sudworth, because in your intervention, you mentioned also that as this pandemic reveals systemic inequalities and as vulnerabilities shift from merely the infected to other types of pre-existing, possibly, but now more visible vulnerabilities, how can religious communities work together? How can they, capitalize on interdependencies? But also, what can governments and policymakers do to support their work, if anything?
Again, that's a big question, and it will differ depending on each context. Obviously, in our British context, I'm part of a church which is established and has a role in public life anyway, and a voice to government. In that context here, I think we have a responsibility as a Church of England to be in greater partnership with both other Christian traditions and other faith groups in expressing shared concerns. So that it's across a range of approaches in other countries, and for ourselves as a question of advocacy, speaking out on behalf of the most vulnerable. And I think the challenges that governments have economically are such that it will be very easy for those who don't have a voice to be readily overlooked. And one of our responsibilities is to be speaking together. Again, it's been Professor Samak talk from a Muslim perspective about the human family, and I would want to echo that from my Christian perspective. The image of God that is there in every single human being means that we advocate for the life and the flourishing of every single person. And if we can do that across groups, then we are more powerful. We can speak with more authority. Part of that voice as well gains authority when we are doing things together. So the kind of illustration that I mentioned of the church working with the local Hindu temple to provide food gives them authority to be able to point out to government, local and national, look, there are families that aren't getting enough food. Can we make sure that through the school holidays of the summer, that the school is kept open to give food to the poorest families, for example? So there is advocacy, there is working together. And then there is the issue of legislation, of specific actions and causes. So I mentioned on the international stage how we can, as faith leaders, really speak about concrete moves to bring peace together. I think of what is an ongoing struggle that's been deepened by the pandemic of civil war in South Sudan. And the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope have worked together across the different Christian communities there to try and work for peace through both the national government and through the United Nations. That's the kind of thing that could be played out across our faith traditions in many areas, where actually what has happened has been a deepening of some civil war and unrest because of what this pandemic has heightened.
Thank you very much. I'd like to lead on from what you said in my next question. Unfortunately, I wish we could take all of the questions that the attendees are pouring in. And I wish that I didn't have to ask our panelists to keep their answers short while asking them the broadest questions in the world. But unfortunately, I think that's a pitfall of the medium and the format. But my next question would be leading on from something you said, Reverend Sadwat, to Dr. Aram, which you also mentioned in your presentation, which is how religious communities or religious organizations can learn from past lessons. So as someone who's been active in the field of public health yourself, what are some lessons that religious groups have learned from previous crisis situations? So for example, Ebola, or you mentioned HIV, that could be possibly applied in this case as well?
Thank you, Naina. That's an important question, and I might answer it in two parts. One is looking at past experience. So I think in the past, we have seen that working together doesn't happen automatically. Working together requires either a previous experience or it requires people to come together. So in the example that I had given from India early on in the epidemic, my city, which has 1.8 million people in the south of India, had communal riots before. And so as soon as we picked up the pointing towards one religious community for the spread of the pandemic, we came together. So I think at the highest level, leaders have to speak to one another, and then there also has to be a practical expression to it. So what we learned, I will go to HIV again. What we learned was that first, ownership of the problem. Reverend Russell spoke about shared concern, but you have to again articulate this shared concern. So whether it is the spread of the pandemic, whether it is closing down of congregations and how that is related to the spread, whether it is requesting people to maintain physical distancing. I think these are things that we have learned requires affirmation and repetition and validation. So all of this, I think faith communities can do well. The third is, I think, along with talking, I think concrete action. And so I've been very encouraged, just like in the UK and India, to see how religious communities are providing warm meals, providing together, also dry ration for the most vulnerable communities. All these concrete actions actually bring us much more closer together. The third thing is also, confronting challenges like, Black Lives Matter, that has traveled all the way from the US here. We've also seen how there has been, violence that has erupted. For example, again, in some parts of India, the treatment of migrant workers. I mean, the public consciousness in this country has been shaken in the way that we have been both humane but also inhuman sometimes in dealing with our own brothers and sisters. So I think advocacy, reminding ourselves over and over again of the power of doing things together, but also confronting some of the disturbing aspects of community life together as to how we have treated them. And again, I want to join Professor Samak, Rabbi Rosen, and the others to say those eternal messages from our faith traditions, that every life is precious, every human being has a dignity that has to be upheld by the community at large, no matter what faith tradition. So all of these things, Naina, goes back to what we have learned in the past, but of course, it has to be reinterpreted for today's context. So again, violence against women. This is something that across India, we are now speaking about it, violence against children. Not just my country, I know it's worldwide, but we are speaking about it because while people are very preoccupied with the pandemic, also the consequences in wider circles have to be done. And with Reverend Saswat, I think I also want to say that this is a moment for us to not only experience this interconnectedness in our local communities, but also to share on issues that we are globally concerned. And so I think all of these religious communities have to sit down. Somebody has to take the leadership sometimes, and many have to think together to be able to provide a coherent but also an impactful message and action on the ground.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ram. There's a question here from India about hate speech and how it is affecting especially young people and who are feeling isolated and disconnected from their communities and discouraged in a way. So I'd like to possibly throw that question to you, Rabbi Rosen, because you spoke in your intervention about this problem of stereotyping and negative perceptions.
Well, I wish I had a simple answer to this question. It's a very important issue. And I can only give the simple wisdom of all our religious traditions is that the only long-term way to combat darkness is to be able to generate light. And therefore, the more, especially people in positions of religious leadership, but I would say any area of leadership, affirm the principles that we've heard articulated of the dignity of every human person, each created in the divine image, each of inalienable value, and combat the dehumanization and disparagement of others, the truer we are to our religious traditions. And if we fail to do so, we are betraying those. I think it's really important, however, that the the communities that are being stigmatized, there's communities that are doing the stigmatization, that leadership from those communities is enlisted. And I think it's something which people who confront the problems need to be able to turn to organizations like KAICIID or like organizations from Religions for Peace and to draw on those resources. So if you have a situation of where Jews are stigmatizing Muslims in any derogatory way, or Hindus are doing so towards Sikhs, or whatever the system may be, then one needs to go to religious authorities and representatives from those communities that are from whence that negativity is drawing. Were you able to hear me? Now can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Rabbi, we can hear you.
So those communities, we need to draw on religious leadership, on community leadership from those communities from whence the stigmatization arises. And if one can't do it directly, one needs to use the interfaith bodies like KAICIID and such other organizations to do so. So I think that whoever asked the question, I would say the ball needs to go back to you to be able to draw on the resources that we want to offer. That's why organizations like KAICIID were established, precisely to offer those resources so that we can address such kinds of misbehavior.
Naina, can I add just a point to that?
Please do.
Naina, I think this stigmatization and using of social media has been in the forefront. And one of the encouraging examples I found about a collaboration between interfaith organizations, faith community, and the government was the way that immediate legislation was brought out on the cost of forwarding hate messages. So today in India, and this was in the course of the pandemic, if you forward a hate message and you can point towards the source, they can actually be they can be booked under law here. So this was only in the last 3-4 months. So there is also, I think, this representation of the cost of hate speech that was brought to our government, and the government has acted on it. In fact, a step further, that from one single source, the same messages cannot be forwarded to more than 4 people. So we've been able to work also in a very short time frame on some of these actions within the country. And I just wanted to add what this immediate response has meant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosen and Dr. Ram. I'd like to turn to Dr. Samak now with a question about economic vulnerability, especially in the context of Lebanon, and how faith communities have been working around that specific location. I think we'll shelve that question until Dr. Samak is able to reconnect. Dr. Samak, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. Well, as you know, Lebanon is in a very critical position. The country is almost on the verge of a failed state, and this makes the religious communities more responsible to look after their communities. And I can say that the religious communities actually are doing their best to help economically and socially the vulnerable, and more than 60% of the Lebanese people today are vulnerable citizens. Lost their jobs, lost their security, lost their positions. Lebanon is in a very critical position today. And historically speaking, the religious leaders in Lebanon and religious institutions, they did all they can to help. But today, they don't have the means, actually. And by the time, they are losing more and more the means to help. We are facing now in Lebanon something we never experienced before. All communities, Christians from different denominations, Muslims from different denominations, all are suffering, and we are on the verge of collapse. The state is in a more danger, but the communities are working together through religious leaders, through donations, charity houses, but this cannot go on for a long time. And there is no limit. I cannot see a way out, I mean, for the current crisis in Lebanon, because there is no genuine I don't want to speak about the political background of this problem now on this meeting, but Lebanon never faced a social situation like this. And this is the point I would like to say. Religious leaders of Lebanon never found themselves obliged to be part of the solution in the current problem, and but they don't have the means to go ahead with it for that time. Anyway, Lebanon was living in a like a rich country, but it is not rich. Today, Lebanon is living like a very poor country, and it is a poor country.
Thank you very much for that very insightful explanation, Dr. Samak. I'd like to throw our second to last question to Sheikh Alashukr Pashazadeh. And the question is, what would be the most effective action that we could jointly adopt to ensure that governments support our capacity as faith organizations to articulate our values of justice and peace for all? Can I just ask all attendees to please switch to the English track on the interpretation if you'd like to hear the English.
I would like to bring example, of course, from Azerbaijani context. In Azerbaijan, we have under the government, under the office of the prime minister, we have a special headquarters set up. And the religious leaders are very closely involved in the making decisions. So whenever we face any challenges together with the government, if there's assistance and an intervention need from religious leaders, we, of course, always intervene. And it would be great to see this state and religious harmony among other states as well, be it outreach to public health, be it assistance or financial assistance, or be it just a moral assistance. Working together is much more effective. So this is my advice, to work together with the government. In Azerbaijan, it has proven to be effective. And sometimes, not just Muslims, we pay a visit to the homes of Christians, to synagogues, and they come to Muslims. So we are always in close contact, try to help each other. So working together has proven to be very effective. So I would strongly recommend to have this unity between the state and the religious organizations. This is my strong recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the last question that we have time to take today, I'd like to return to my colleague, Muhammad Abu Nimer. There's a question here about what are the challenges that you faced, and I think the questioner means the KAICIID team, but I'd like to broaden that a little bit and ask what are the challenges that this pandemic has presented for interfaith dialogue and specifically also for the work that KAICIID does.
Thank you, Nayana. Thank you, everybody, as well, for your rich examples, as well as for your incredible and I think many inspiring stories from India, from Israel, from Jerusalem as well, in particular, but also from Lebanon and many UK and Azerbaijan. I think it's very rich to listen to all of this, and really the challenges for the COVID-19, it's like any challenge that we face in war situation. When a crisis takes place, the social fabric is threatened and the connection among people is threatened. The social isolation have divided people and did not allow them to interact. And therefore, this major challenge put it in isolation. And therefore, those who were vulnerable in general cannot receive our help and our solidarity. But as we heard here, the solidarity, the emergence of community, the fact that we are able to define the vulnerability not only to the health risk people, but expand it to ethnic, religious, gender, children, age. I think that's a very creative way to look at it and very constructive. In addition, we're discovering that the social cohesion continue and will continue to be a key focus for many of our work in interfaith dialogue. If our social cohesion is not strong and solid, we are all become vulnerable, and not only small communities. Our strength can be reflected in a stronger social cohesion community, socially cohesive community as well. And the magic, as was described by Dr. Aram and also Rabbi Rosen in particular, and in UK, the cure in many ways is in the local community. In our work in interfaith, we found out that the more work on the local community, the much better the resilience you have in the community to deal with it. And finally, we are producing a guide titled Guide for Multi-Faith Reaction to COVID-19, where we put some principles and some strategies and lessons learned in how the multi-faith approach is essential and crucial for our work in interfaith dialogue and also for the faith-based community. The more multi-faith work we do, the more resilient our community will be. So these are my final comments. Thank you, Nayana, as well.
Thank you, Professor Abunimar. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Rabbi Rosen, Dr. Aram, Dr. Samak, Reverend Sudworth, and Professor Dr. Pashazadeh. You each joined us from completely different time zones in different parts of the world and given us so much of your time. We're very grateful. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. It's a very broad topic, we realize that, and there's just no way to do it justice in an hour and a half. But I hope we've given you all something to think about, and we hope very much that you'll stay in touch with us and engage with KAICIID in the future as well. Thank you very, very much for your time. I've enjoyed this.